They never meant for you to hear this. Not you, not anyone outside their bloodline, but some secrets. Decay slower than the flesh. In 1856, beneath the floorboards of a ruined church in Millfield, Ohio, a hidden compartment was unearthed, sealed behind a mechanism so precise it could only have been crafted by a mind obsessed with permanence. What the workers found wasn't treasure, it wasn't relics, it was a book, bound in leather, weathered, untouched by time. Inside, 12,000 names, each one marked with a date, a location, a cause of death, and something worse. Next to every death, a calculated value in dollars, a note about property, a line item profit. This was not a memorial, it was a ledger, a business record of death. Alongside it, 15 maps, old, fragile, detailed, each one marked with the same phrase, the promised land. But the lands they highlighted weren't fertile fields or divine blessings. They were plague zones, floodplains, swamps, graveyards waiting to be filled. The maps weren't leading the faithful to salvation. They were guiding them into ruin. And at the center of this conspiracy, written in the same precise calligraphic hand, was a name carved into American soil like a curse that refused to fade: Westbrook. For 34 years, across 3 states, under the guise of divine revelation, the Westbrook brothers orchestrated one of the most systematic, spiritually disguised land exterminations in American history. And it worked, because they didn't sell land. They sold heaven to those desperate to find it. This isn't just a story about greed. It's not about religion or corruption. It's about design. A dark architecture built from faith, fear, and financial genius. You weren't meant to find this channel, and now that you have, you won't be the same. We're going to uncover everything, piece by piece. But I need your focus, and your silence. Because the Westbrooks may be long dead, but what they built, it's still standing. They arrived quietly, not as conquerors, not as criminals, but as saints. The year was 1803. The Ohio frontier was raw, wild, and hungering for order. And into that emptiness stepped Isaiah Westbrook, a towering figure with the voice of a prophet and eyes like polished steel. He didn't bring soldiers, he brought sermons. He didn't carry weapons, he carried the word. And the settlers, weary, desperate, isolated, they listened. Isaiah claimed he had received divine visions, that God had shown him a path through the wilderness to a sacred inheritance. But what he truly possessed was something far more dangerous than divine favor. He had a plan, a psychological blueprint. He knew something about men most never dare admit. When life strips them of power, they will trade everything for meaning. Faith is a drug. But when weaponized with land, law, and family structure, it becomes a system of control. Isaiah's sermons were perfectly engineered, not overly emotional. No, that was too obvious. Instead, he offered certainty cloaked in mystery. He spoke of a new Jerusalem, a land that awaited the faithful, untouched by sin, unspoiled by corruption. He described it in such detail that his followers saw it in their dreams. But he was never alone. Behind the pulpit, behind the scripture, were Daniel and Samuel Westbrook, his younger brothers. Daniel, the theologian, Yale-trained before scandal forced him to disappear. Samuel, the financier, the builder, the forger, quiet, ruthless, always watching. While Isaiah stirred souls, Daniel rewrote doctrine, and Samuel, he bought land. Not just any land, cursed land. Land where no crops would grow, where fever bloomed in the air, where bodies sank silently into the swamp. The Westbrooks didn't need bullets. They used belief. Their first settlement was a masterpiece of manipulation, marketed as divinely chosen. It was in fact, a proven malaria zone. Locals avoided it. Surveyors had marked it as unsuitable, but Isaiah declared it holy, and the people, trusting in his vision, followed him into death. Within 3 months, 47 graves, children, mothers, buried beneath a promise. And what did Samuel do? He logged every death, like inventory, then reclaimed the land and resold it. Again. That was just the beginning. You've heard of prosperity gospel? This was mortality gospel, and the more they preached, the more they profited. Ask yourself this: what kind of man keeps perfect records of other men's deaths, not out of grief, but out of arithmetic? Samuel Westbrook was not a monster in the way stories teach us to fear. He wore no black cloak, he gave no rants. He kept ledgers. The only emotion in Samuel's face, noted by a surviving settler, was a kind of sterile pride, the satisfaction of a man who saw systems where others saw suffering. Every child who died, a number. Every widow, a recalculated asset. Every failed settlement, a stepping stone to the next. When the first community collapsed, Samuel moved quickly. He invoked what he called the Covenant of Glory, a religious contract written by Daniel, sealed by Isaiah, and signed by every settler. It was marketed as a faith commitment. In truth, it was a legal trap. Buried within the flowery language of spiritual devotion was a clause. Should I fall before the fulfillment of my covenant, or should I depart from this holy land, I hereby return all holdings to the ministry of the new promise. In legal terms, the Westbrooks got it all: land, tools, livestock, buildings. If you died, it was theirs. If you fled, it was theirs. And most did die, or fled, or went mad. But the Westbrooks stayed, because they were never building a faith. They were running a machine, a divine Ponzi scheme fueled by desperation and sealed by death. The second settlement was even worse, positioned in a lush lowland, a trap. Locals avoided it due to spring floods and parasitic outbreaks, but Isaiah stood on its banks and declared, "The river of life flows here." Men sold everything they owned to follow him. Entire families marched into that verdant grave. By winter, nearly 60% were dead, the rest were broke, and too ashamed to speak out. Why didn't anyone stop them? Because the Westbrooks were untouchable. They registered churches, not businesses. Hay quoted scripture, not contracts. They baptized, buried, and bankrupted, all under the veil of divine law. This is the sickness no one talks about. The way power wraps itself in holiness, how evil wears the mask of salvation. This isn't history, it's a pattern, and it's not over. Silence is not always the absence of noise. Sometimes it is the presence of fear, engineered, manufactured, and weaponized. The Westbrooks didn't just manipulate land and law, they mastered the art of obliteration, not of the body, but of witness. The first man to speak out publicly against them was a local tradesman named James Harrington, a former settler who'd lost 3 of his children in the first Promised Land colony. He called the settlement a ritual of slaughter, and Isaiah Westbrook, a liar wrapped in scripture. Harrington's words spread quickly. A few letters published in local newspapers, a heated town meeting in Lancaster, an unofficial inquiry begun by a magistrate. Then, nothing. 2 weeks later, James Harrington was found face down in the canal. Ruled an accident. No signs of foul play, no further investigation. But those who saw the body whispered about the bruises, the angle of the wounds, the mouth torn open, as if silenced mid-scream. The magistrate, transferred without explanation. The articles, retracted. The letters, lost. This was not coincidence. This was correction. You must understand, the Westbrooks didn't control newspapers. They didn't need to. They controlled faith. And when faith becomes infrastructure, it silences dissent like a noose wrapped in velvet. Their congregation doubled after Harrington's death. Isaiah preached of righteous persecution. He said Satan was testing them, using false prophets and bitter men to sow division. He held a candlelit sermon the night after Harrington's funeral. Hundreds came. They wept. They prayed. They forgot. This is how institutional evil survives, not by brute force, but by drowning truth in a ritual of collective memory loss. And what about those inside the settlements? The diaries of women like Elizabeth Winters speak volumes. She wrote of neighbors too afraid to question. The deaths, too loyal to ask why the soil killed crops, too devout to doubt Isaiah's word. She wrote this: "We are not a congregation. We are a procession, headed toward a grave no one dares name." That was her final entry. Her husband claimed she had a fever. No autopsy, no grave marker. The Westbrooks didn't silence everyone. They taught people to silence themselves. Real power doesn't shout. It signs paperwork. By 1812, the Westbrook brothers were no longer merely preachers. They were cartographers of death, mapping suffering, assigning value, and profiting from ruin. But what made them unstoppable wasn't charisma or theology. It was infrastructure. Samuel Westbrook, the youngest, was the architect of their control. He studied deeds like they were scripture. He understood something most don't: that in America, land isn't just land. It's leverage. It's legacy. It's law. And Samuel didn't need to own the land to control it. He created an intricate web of shell trustees, using false names and fabricated congregational boards to hold property on behalf of the church. These legal ghosts ensured no lawsuit could ever touch the brothers directly. No matter how many people died, how many settlements collapsed, on paper, the land was always owned by the Church of the New Promise, a church with no fixed address, no charter, no accountability. This is where the covenants of glory became lethal. You remember those faith documents? They weren't just spiritual oaths. They were binding contracts, crafted by Daniel, revised annually, and cross-signed by Samuel's proxies. The clauses were buried in poetic scripture. "Should my soul ascend before harvest, may the fruits of my labor nourish the church," which in plain language meant, if you die, we keep everything. Samuel also ensured that every settler was in debt to the church: tools, seeds, livestock, cabins, all issued through internal ledgers tied to sacred obligation. Miss a payment? You're backsliding. Get sick? It's God's test. Die? The Westbrooks reclaim what's theirs. They turned faith into a mortgage, and no one stopped them, because the courts saw churches, not corporations, because towns saw ministers, not men with mining maps and demographic charts. And still, Isaiah preached. He told the faithful their suffering was holy. That plague was purification, that the land was rejecting the impure to prepare for the righteous. What no one knew, not even some of the brothers' closest allies, was that Samuel had begun forging death certificates to expedite claims. Whole families erased with the stroke of a quill. They didn't just bury bodies, they laundered souls. And behind it all, they smiled like shepherds. What if I told you they wanted to die? Not because they were suicidal, not because they were coerced, but because they believed their suffering was divine currency. This was the true genius, or the true evil, of Daniel Westbrook. While Isaiah spoke with thunder and Samuel signed the deeds, Daniel crafted the theology that turned death into destiny. He called it the Promised Land Prophecy. It was a doctrine hidden inside sermons, laced into hymns, embedded into prayer. And it said this: "Those who perish in the Lord's land die not as victims, but as forerunners. Their deaths sanctify the soil, preparing it for the next wave of the faithful." It was spiritual Darwinism, suffering as selection, death as initiation. This theology served two purposes. First, it neutralized doubt. If your child died of fever, it wasn't God abandoning you. It was God choosing them. If your crops failed, it wasn't fraud. It was a trial. And if your entire community was wiped out, it meant they were too pure for this world. Second, it guaranteed silence. Because to criticize the settlement was to question the fate of your dead, and no grieving mother wants to believe her child died for a lie. So they clung tighter, prayed harder, and buried truth with the bodies. Isaiah used this doctrine like a scalpel. After each settlement collapse, he preached sermons about sacrificial victory. He'd read names from the death ledger, not as mourners but as martyrs. He'd cry real tears, kneel before the congregation, and declare, "The Lord has revealed the next promised land. We go not away from death, but through it, to glory." And they believed him, again and again and again. You need to understand something. This wasn't a cult of weakness. It was a system of voluntary obedience fueled by grief and coded in scripture. Most cults collapse under the weight of reality. The Westby Rooks created a system that thrived when people died, because death wasn't the end. It was the advertisement. The more they buried, the more they sold. The maps were beautiful, 15 of them, hand-drawn, meticulously inked, each one bordered by religious iconography, doves, crosses, stars, angels, each one a trap. They were found in 1856, sealed beneath the pulpit of the Millfield Church, alongside the death ledger. At first glance, they appeared devotional, land charts annotated with Bible verses and glowing references to the Promised Land. But look closer, and you see the engineering, topographic markings, soil drainage patterns, swamp density, flood cycle calculations, and notations in the margins. Optimal for first-year mortality. Projected outbreak, late summer. Accessible from Lancaster Road. Recommends summer recruitment. These were not maps of salvation. They were manuals. Each map represented a potential settlement site. Each site had been scouted, analyzed, and weaponized. Because the Westbrooks were not just preachers. They were planners, strategists. And their goal wasn't just profit. It was pattern recognition, testing locations, studying variables, predicting human behavior in the face of suffering. Let that sink in. They weren't choosing bad land by mistake. They were conducting field experiments. Every new settlement was a trial. How long would it take for people to question the deaths? How many families would flee before breaking point? What phrases, what verses, what sermons best suppressed rebellion? Each map was marked with a phrase, always the same, to be opened when the soil has been fed. The soil. Fed. Not blessed. Not cleansed. Fed. There are places in the Midwest where settlers disappeared without explanation. Entire villages swallowed by plague and silence. And if you overlay the Westbrook maps on modern terrain, you'll find a match. Some of those sites are now luxury developments. Golf courses. Gated communities, neighborhoods with names like Providence Estates and Zion Ridge. Do you understand what that means? Your backyard might be built over a Westbrook grave, and no one told you. Because no one knows. Because the truth was buried under sermons and cement. But now you know, and now you see. They called it Red Harvest, but you won't find that name in any official record. Not in county archives, not in church histories, not in newspapers. Because what happened in the 8th settlement was too dangerous to document. Not just because people died, but because they rebelled. The site was near present-day Ephraim, Indiana. On paper, it was like the others, a lush, untouched stretch of river valley, blessed by divine providence. But it was different in one key way. One man had seen the Westbrooks before. His name was Nathaniel Crow, a former carpenter from Moran who had lost his sister and nephews in a previous promised land. But when he relocated to Indiana, he changed his name, laid low, and watched, until he saw them again. Isaiah preaching, Daniel transcribing, Samuel measuring soil. And that's when Crow did the unthinkable. He infiltrated them. He joined the congregation under a false name. He memorized sermons. He helped build cabins. He studied the covenant papers. And in secret, he warned others, but not loudly. He didn't scream fraud. He whispered truths, small doubts, private questions, and like a virus, the awareness spread. By the second month of settlement, something rare happened. People stopped obeying. They stopped attending services. They stopped tithing. And then, they refused the next covenant. Daniel was furious. Samuel issued quiet threats. But Isaiah, he grew still. One Sunday he delivered a sermon different from all the others. He spoke of Judas among the faithful, of a cleansing fire that must come before glory. He wept, he knelt, he prayed. And that night, 3 cabins burned to the ground. Families were found locked inside. Nathaniel Crow vanished. No body was recovered. Only a journal fragment nailed to a tree at the settlement's edge. The Lord sees all, but so do men who know the soil was never holy. The next day the settlement was evacuated forcibly. The Westbrooks blamed enemy agitators. Daniel declared that God had closed the gate. The land was reclaimed, the buildings razed, the dead forgotten, but not by everyone. This event, the only recorded resistance, sent a shock through the Westbrook network. It forced them underground. It refined their methods. They learned, never let the sheep notice the fence. They say religion was their mask. But what most forget is this: government was their armor. By 1825, the Westbrooks were no longer just orchestrating cult settlements in the backwoods. They were integrating themselves into the machinery of American expansion. Isaiah remained the spiritual face. But it was Samuel who began making quiet visits to courthouses, to land offices, to regional tax boards. He didn't walk in as a prophet. He walked in as a land agent. You see, as the American frontier surged westward, the government needed men who could bring order to chaos, men who could settle land, organize communities, and civilize the frontier. Samuel presented the Church of the New Promise as exactly that. A moral, industrious movement of God-fearing settlers who would turn wilderness into productivity. He offered maps, population estimates, theological community charters, and they bought it. They gave him preferential purchase rights, discounted land rates for religious reclamation. In some counties, the Westbrooks even wrote the zoning rules. The predator was now disguised as planner. Daniel, meanwhile, began publishing religious pamphlets, official ones, distributed with government subsidy. Titles like Sanctified Labor, The Divine Duty of Western Man, and Faithful Expansion, A Guide to Godly Settlement. But hidden in these texts were the same doctrines of death, the same metaphors of sacrifice, the same coded language about soil fed with blood. They were no longer speaking to just congregations. They were speaking to policymakers, to clerks, to militia leaders. And those leaders began recruiting from Westbrook settlements for railroad labor, canal projects, and local militias. Why? Because these men were obedient, conditioned to suffer, trained to trust. The Westbrooks had created a population designed for control, and now the state wanted it. By 1830, several counties in Ohio and Indiana had more than half their land holdings touched, directly or indirectly, by a Westbrook-linked entity, and not just churches, lumber yards, tanneries, brickworks, even courthouses were built by former Promised Land laborers. That's the dark secret here. The Westbrooks weren't an isolated cult. They were a prototype, a living experiment in how to fuse spiritual surrender with economic servitude backed by civic authority. And it worked. It still works. It was not a journal. It was a calculus of mortality, bound in cracked leather, sealed with 3 iron clasps, and hidden beneath a pulpit carved by Samuel himself. The Ledger of the Dead is the most chilling artifact ever tied to the Westbrook legacy. Discovered in 1856, then vanished. Recovered once in 1911, then sealed again, mentioned only in whispers, and for good reason. Because this was not simply a record of the dead. It was a model, 1,041 names, each meticulously handwritten in the same ink, the same hand, almost certainly Daniel's. Next to each name, date of death, age, cause, number of dependents, and projected economic loss or gain. Yes, gain, You read that right. Each soul was assigned a value, not in emotional terms, not in spiritual symbolism, in dollars, in timber output, fertile acreage, progeny potential, and resource liquidation. Children were listed as net liability, future tithe. Women of childbearing age were marked with a coded star, M1, M2, etc. Elderly settlers were recorded as reclaimable realty, high probability. There were entire columns labeled sacrificial yield, spiritual leverage, resale timing, optimal window. This wasn't theology. It was data science, a century too early. And the maps found beside the ledger, they matched. In fact, the data in the ledger was so precise, some entries appeared before the actual recorded deaths occurred. As if Daniel had calculated, with terrifying accuracy, not just who would die, but when and why. It begs the question, was this a record or a blueprint? Was the suffering in the promised lands spontaneous or orchestrated? There are entries that describe events decades before they happened. Spring fever migration, 1817, 42 bodies, reclamation net gain, $1,128. But the Millfield County Register didn't record that incident until 1823. This wasn't prophecy, it was logistics. And that ledger, it disappeared from a locked sheriff's cabinet the night after its discovery. The next morning, the sheriff was found dead. Heart failure. But his eyes, they were wide open, as if they had seen the prophet of death and couldn't bear to close. They preached salvation, but what they engineered was submission. Isaiah's sermons were not mere religious speeches. They were psychological operations, weaponized rhetoric designed to fracture minds and bind wills. The language was carefully calibrated. Every phrase, every cadence, every pause drilled obedience deep into the psyche. You are chosen, Isaiah would say, voice low and commanding. You are part of a sacred covenant. Your suffering is a gift. And the crowd, desperate for meaning, hung on every word. But the true genius, Daniel's work, was in the layers of suggestion hidden beneath the obvious. He embedded coded triggers into hymns, prayers, and scripture readings. Words that echoed primal fears and desires. Symbols that flickered in the mind like shadows. His writings reflected an understanding of early cognitive conditioning, long before psychology became a science. He knew how to induce cognitive dissonance, learned helplessness, dissociative obedience. The goal was breaking resistance. Historians uncovered letters from a former follower named Caleb Turner. In 1812, Caleb had written to a relative describing his experience. I found myself doubting less with every sermon. My thoughts no longer my own, but the voice in the pulpit. I did not even realize the chains had bound me until I tried to leave, and found the door locked. Caleb disappeared months later. The Westbrook's process was systematic. Within 90 days, new recruits were psychologically dismantled, their independent will replaced with absolute faith. How? Repetition, ritual, isolation. Mornings began with communal prayer, afternoons with physical labor, evenings with sermons, nightfall with confessions. Their minds were flooded, senses overloaded, sleep deprived. This was not faith. It was conditioning. The Westbrooks created a mind prison, where faith and fear urged indistinguishably. And the key, their victims didn't resist. They wanted to believe, because in that darkness, surrender felt like salvation. What kept the Westbrooks safe for decades wasn't just fear, it was silence. A vast, tangled network of complicity that stretched beyond the frontier churches into the halls of power. Local officials, clergy, businessmen, many had direct ties to the Westbrook enterprise. Some were bribed, some were threatened, some willingly turned a blind eye. The methods of control were subtle, calculated, and relentless. Letters discovered in the archives show coded threats. Discretion preserves life. Questions lead to ruin. Loyalty is rewarded. Anyone who dared investigate the promised lands was met with sudden ruin, financial, social, or physical. Sheriff William Blackwood's death was just the beginning. His deputy, Thomas Reed, fled the state after witnessing things no man should see. Other officials quietly resigned. Reporters disappeared. Historians who pursued the story found their careers derailed or worse. This web of silence was maintained through fear and manipulation. Whispers of curses, rumors of hauntings, stories of divine retribution. Isaiah used these rumors like a weapon, telling followers that outsiders were instruments of Satan, sent to destroy their faith. This created an us versus them mentality so strong it isolated the settlements further. But beyond the fear, there was profit. Merchants supplied the Westbrook communities on credit. Local banks held mortgages on land deeds. Legal firms specialized in reclaiming abandoned properties. All fed into a system designed to recycle wealth from the dead and dispossessed. The true horror? This network of silence and greed outlived the brothers. It became an institution, a hidden force shaping American expansion, protecting its secrets with layers of lies and intimidation. And it's still there. Watching. Waiting. Faith was the currency. But it was never just spiritual. The Westbrooks forged a secret covenant, a legal document disguised as a sacred vow that bound their followers' lives, land, and legacies. Every settler was required to sign this covenant of eternal allegiance before taking possession of any promised land property. The language was poetic, biblical, cloaked in reverence and devotion. But beneath the sanctified words lay a brutal truth. This covenant transferred all property rights to the Westbrook Church. If a settler abandoned the land, died without heirs in the faith, or even faltered in belief, the covenant stated, "As Moses led his people through trials and promised lands, so too do I consecrate my earthly possessions to the ministry that guides my soul." Legally binding and airtight, it allowed the Westbrooks to reclaim land without compensation. Imagine it. Families losing everything, their homes, farms, livelihoods, because the covenant sealed their fate. It was a spiritual trap and a financial death sentence. This legal weapon was crafted meticulously by Daniel, who consulted shadowy Cincinnati lawyers to perfect its language. Court records from Franklin County reveal a staggering truth. Between 1812 and 1815 alone, the Westbrooks reclaimed over 400 parcels of land through covenant enforcement. That's millions in today's currency, all extracted from grieving families shattered by disease, famine, and despair. And it wasn't just property. The covenant also ensured control over inheritances. Children born outside the faith or raised outside Westbrook doctrine were disinherited. Families were fractured, loyalty to the church superseding blood ties. This created generations of followers trapped in a cycle of devotion and dispossession. The covenant was more than a document. It was a psychological chain. It transformed faith into ownership, belief into bondage. And it worked because no one read the fine print, too blinded by promises of salvation. Now, pause here and type in the comments this phrase twice to lock in your awareness. I see through the veil. I claim my truth. This is your key, your declaration, your first step beyond the shadows. Ritual was their hammer. Ceremony, their chains. The Westbrooks understood something primal, that humans crave structure, rhythm, and belonging. So they crafted rituals that were part worship, part control. Every sunrise began with the morning consecration, a gathering where followers repeated oaths in unison, their voices rising like a tide, drowning individual thought. The language was hypnotic. I surrender my will to the sacred path. I walk the promised land in faith. I am cleansed by sacrifice and bound by love. Repeated daily, these phrases became mental anchors, imprinting obedience deeper than any sermon could. But the true power lay in the Night of Atonement, a monthly ceremony shrouded in darkness. Settlers would gather in the church's crypt-like basement, lit only by flickering candles. Here, confessions weren't just spiritual, they were public trials. Every doubt, every hesitation was spoken aloud and condemned. This shattered any lingering resistance. The accused were marked, sometimes with a token, a symbol etched onto clothing or skin, branding them as weak or impure. Those tokens marked them for exclusion, for surveillance, for punishment. Physical labor was another ritual, meticulously designed, clearing swamplands, building cabins, hauling timber, all under constant spiritual supervision. The Westbrooks preached that hardship was purification, pain a path to redemption, but it was also exhaustion, mental, emotional, physical exhaustion, breaking the individual until they merged into the collective. Letters from escapees describe an eerie silence that fell over the settlements after these rituals, a kind of numb submission where even anger was extinguished. Identity was stripped, free will was surrendered, and a new self emerged, one defined only by the Westbrook Covenant. This was no accident, it was engineered erasure. The Westbrooks didn't just build settlements, they built obedient minds. Leaving wasn't freedom, it was a sentence. Families who fled the promised lands believed escape meant salvation. But the Westbrooks had eyes everywhere, a network of informants and enforcers lurking beyond the boundaries of every settlement. No one who abandoned their covenant vanished without consequence. Some were found dead, their bodies discovered days or weeks later in the wilderness, cold, starved, or marked with strange symbols carved into their skin. Others disappeared without a trace. Elizabeth Winters, widow of one early follower, documented whispered tales in her hidden diary. Those who leave the path find no peace. Shadows follow them. The ground itself betrays. Militia groups, under the guise of maintaining order, were deployed to track down runaways, often with brutal results. Court records reveal disturbing cases where escapees were forcibly returned, jailed, or even executed for breaking sacred trust. Some local sheriffs were sympathetic, but most feared the Westbrooks' influence or the mysterious blessings the family purported to wield. Rumors spread of strange ailments striking those who defied the covenant, sudden paralysis, inexplicable fevers, or madness. Modern researchers speculate these were deliberate poisonings or psychological terror campaigns designed to instill dread. But the darkest secret was that the Westbrooks maintained a hidden militia, a paramilitary force trained in frontier warfare and covert intimidation. They moved silently through forests, striking fear into those who dared resist. This force protected the brothers' interests, reclaiming lands, enforcing covenants, silencing dissent. The frontier's brutal realities worked in their favor. Harsh winters, wild terrain, and lawlessness made resistance costly and dangerous. By the time word spread of the Westbrook retaliation, many runaways chose death.